Dr. Andrew Perriman is an amazing man. He has a degree in English language and literature from Oxford University. He also has a Master of Philosophy and a PhD from LST, which is the London School of Theology, around the corner from us. He is a researcher and writer on topics related to eschatology and Christology. He is an associate research professor at the London School of Theology, and he's recently developed a course on hermeneutics and Romans. His latest book, In the Form of a God, explores whether Paul thought that Jesus pre-existed in heaven in the form of a God through whom all things were made. So he also does missionary work with Communitas. He has an oversight role in that. So Dr. Andrew Perriman is an incredibly busy man, and we are delighted to have him here today. So please welcome Dr. Andrew Perriman.
Thank you. I don't think I am an incredibly busy man. I think I'm a rather lazy man, but personally. I'm also the one Unitarian in a room full of Trinitarians, and how sort of unnerving that feels. I'm guessing I'm the one Trinitarian in a room full of Unitarians. Am I? Yeah, I was trying to sort of explain to Dale earlier that there's some sort of metaphor I'm trying to find for this. My thought was it's sort of like going into Looking Glass world, and it's not quite. That's not the best way of looking at it. Everything is sort of familiar, but there's a few things that aren't quite right. Maybe it's a parallel universe type of experience. It's weird. It's disorienting. You're right. You're friendly enough, and. A little more friendly than I was anticipating, so we'll see how we get on. Yeah, right. I'm sort of not at all sure how this is going to land. I would have trouble landing this in a Trinitarian church. It may be easier in Unitarian Looking Glass world, parallel universe. It may be even harder, we'll see. So if it doesn't land, if this is a sort of a bumpy journey for you, I apologize in advance. If it's not, we'll see how we get on. It's sort of straightforward, sort of semi-academic presentation, if that's okay with you. So in the form of oh no, it's not the title I thought it was. I changed it. No, I've changed the title because I was talking to someone earlier. A romantic. The word romantic is going to be part of this, but people sort of pick up the wrong connotations. Yeah, we get a little sort of gooey when we think about romantic. It's not romantic anti-hero. Let's just think of a religious anti-hero. I'm trying to sort of get at there's a story, I think, going on beneath the surface of this passage, this Philippians 2 passage, this very well-known thing. And the reason why I've got this religious anti-hero thing, I did a first degree in English literature, which has probably something to do with it deep down, long ago, and everything else. There's a story being told, and a main part of what I want to try and do is get that story to the surface and see if it helps us make sense of something that we have tried to deal with in a very sort of narrowly focused exegetical fashion, trying to say, well, what does this word mean? What does that word mean? What does that phrase mean? And so on. So that's why I've got this bit about a religious anti-hero in there. The traditional view for centuries, you don't need me to tell you this, has been that the hymn in quotation marks, Philippians 2, 6-11, tracks the descent of the eternally pre-existent Christ, who existed in the form of God, from heaven to earth, and the return of the resurrected Christ from earth to heaven. Now, the downward journey begins with his refusal either to seize or to hold on to equality with God. He instead empties himself of some aspect of his essential divinity and becomes incarnate as a human person, reaching the nadir of the curve in his humiliating death on the cross. Jack Sanders calls this a cosmograph, and you can see this sort of cosmic journey down and back up again. It follows a rapid upward course, perhaps reaching a height that exceeds the starting point. Now, some attempts have been made to flatten at least the downward movement. Notably, many of you will know, James Dunn argued for an Adam interpretation of being in the form of God, on the grounds that the expression equates to humanity's existence in the image of God. So the descent is Jesus' freely chosen participation in the fall or demotion of the son of Adam from Psalm 8:4. But this parabolic visualization of Christ's itinerary remains deeply embedded in the mainstream Christian. I'm sorry, is it okay if I say that's mainstream? You don't mind being marginalized in that respect? In the mainstream, the past mainstream Christian religious and theological consciousness. So even when being in the form of God has been understood as an affirmation of social status, for example, rather than of ontology, the metaphysical dimension is retained. So, and this is Joseph Hellerman. He's argued for a non-substantial, so it's sort of a non-ontological. This is not about the being of Christ, a non-substantial interpretation of Morphe theou in terms of rank or social status, alluding to Christ's garments of pre-incarnate glory. The form is the clothes that he wears, his glorious garments in his pre-incarnate or pre-existence. The argument I will put forward here is that the Greek phrase Morphe theou, now we're going to have to do some Greek because we can't, it's just impossible otherwise. Usually translated form of God, capital G, has its origins neither in creation narratives, the Adam interpretation, nor in Jewish theological reflection. It signals, I think, at the outset, a pagan perspective on the person of Jesus generated at some cultural distance and geographical distance from the realities of his adult life in Palestine. From this starting point, interpretation must work through a sequence of well-known exegetical puzzles in search of a coherent and relevant narrative. How do we interpret the Harpagmos? That's another word we're going to have to get used to. Harpagmos, we'll come back to that. The grasping, seizing clause. What was equality with God? How is that to be understood? What did it mean for Jesus to empty himself? In what sense did he then take the form of a slave or assume human likeness? And I will suggest that the movement of thought here is best explained by, as I've said, telling other stories, both Jewish and Greek, that not only shed light on the exegetical details, but also expose the dramatic episode that I think lies behind or beneath the terse language of these opening lines. So I will start with some introductory comments, then look at the three main interpretive problems in verse 6, then I'm going to tell some stories, and hopefully that will get us somewhere. So the first point to make briefly is that Philippians 2:6-11 is not a hymn. I mean, we've struggled to know what to call it. We know what hymns are, so it's traditionally been called a hymn. Now, a hymn is, this is classical scholar William Race, a sustained address to divinity. And neither God nor the exalted Jesus is addressed in these lines. So if the passage is to be regarded at all as an independent composition that perhaps preceded the writing of Philippians, it is better thought of as, I think, an encomium. So I'm going to call it an encomium, a piece of rhetoric about a person extolling his or her virtues or achievements. Matthew Gordley writes candidly, if one does not see pre-existence in the opening lines, then one would need to conclude that this was an encomium of an exalted human rather than a hymnos. Given the brevity of the passage, we may prefer to view it as a précis of a more elaborate account than as a formal component in its encomium in its own right. But the reclassification, so calling it an encomium rather than a hymn, encourages us to pay attention to the public appraisal. This is a key point in what I'm trying to say. Public appraisal of Christ's virtues and achievements. So this is an encomium that asks, that presents how people saw him over a course of time. There is no explicit ascent or ascension in the second part of the encomium. So there was supposed to be a descent in the first part and an ascent in the second part, or from your point of view, descent and ascent. There's not even mention of the resurrection in there. It is said only that God highly exalted him and favored him. Huperopsosen is highly exalted. Even in English, a person can be exalted or highly exalted and favored without going anywhere. The verb huperopsoo is not found outside the Septuagint, where it is used for the exaltation or lifting up either of an impious person, that's in Psalm 36, or more normally of God, who is greatly exalted above all the gods, or praised and highly exalted for the ages. The meaning in Philippians 2:9, therefore, I think, is that Christ now enjoys an exalted and favored status among others, a name or reputation above all other names that will trigger a far-reaching transformation of the old political religious order. And one point I will make, and sort of meant to make at the start, is I think in a way this is much more about eschatology than about Christology. And I think this future-looking part is important. Any thought of elevation, in any case, in the term, is strictly metaphorical. Now this should make us reconsider the assumption of some sort of metaphysical descent in the first part of the encomium. I will argue that the issue is not a movement between two realms, earth and heaven, but certain astonishing shifts in the public estimation of the one whom some Greeks in Philippi already, in anticipation, acclaim as Lord over the empire, over the Greek and Roman world. It's not Jesus who comes down and goes up, it's the Greek evaluation of him that goes down and goes up. Thirdly, Paul's good news for the peoples of the Greek and Roman world was that Jesus had been appointed Son of God in power, according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead, and that he would therefore in due course inherit these nations to rule over them. That's generally from Romans, the beginning of Romans and from the end of Romans. Yeah, go on, press it, because the apostle points forward to a future realization of this hope. Because the Gentiles have come to believe that the root of Jesse would rule over them as nations. Now, Jesus had been made known, therefore, to both Jews and Greeks across Asia Minor and around the Aegean as an invisible, heavenly Son of God, or Kurios, Lord, called on in prayer, seen in visions, encountered through pneumatic experience. Those who came to believe, therefore, began in the Spirit, not where the first disciples began in the towns and villages of Galilee. But this Spirit Lord was also proclaimed by Jews, the apostles, Jewish apostles, as Israel's Messiah. And that was deeply problematic, and accounts, we may add, for a good part of Paul's teaching. Why would the God of Israel highly exalt, promote a disgraced, crucified pretender to the throne of David? Why were all these converts from paganism not required to keep the Jewish law? How was this proclamation or gospel a legitimate development within the story of Israel? So yes, there was a very important question about pre-existence to be asked. And indeed, Paul occasionally has cause to point backwards to a backstory. Jesus was a descendant of David according to the flesh. He had been sent in the manner of Moses and the prophets as they had been sent, not at some arbitrary intersection of time and space, but at a critical moment in the history of his people to redeem those under the law. It's Galatians. He had been crucified alongside other agents of political disorder by the rulers of the dark and troubled period through which Israel was going, but God had raised him from the dead. And you notice, therefore, then that there are 3 crosses there and not just one, because alongside him are the 2, who were they? Lestes, militants, like people like Barabbas, executed because of some sort of insurrection. Insurrectionists, that's the word I was looking for. The backstory is also found in the first part of the dense summary of the career of Jesus in Philippians 2, 6 to 11. But we may wonder if there was really anything in the logic of Paul's proclamation that required a pre-existence before the pre-existence of the exalted Lord. So now let's have a look at the three main exegetical problems in verse 6. The phrase morphe theou, the did not regard as something to be grasped idiom, and the idea of having equality with God. Despite an immense amount of scholarly argumentation to the contrary, it seems to me well nigh impossible to maintain that the phrase en morphe theou is a reference to the form of the one God of Israel, who made the heavens and the earth. Both inside and outside the literature of Hellenistic Judaism, morphe consistently signifies the outward appearance of a person or object. If you grew up in this country in the 70s, you may remember Morphe, a plasticine man who featured in the children's show Take Heart. Who remembers Morphe? He is called Morphe because he can change shape. He takes different forms. He can change his outward appearance, and metamorphosis as a change of form. The whole point of morph is he has a visible shape. What is invisible does not have a shape or outward appearance. One cannot escape the fact that morphe signifies visible appearance, and the God of Israel does not have a visible appearance. I just said that. So now there's a couple of purported exceptions to this rule, which scholars propose, but I think they can be dismissed. The Alexandrian Jewish philosopher Philo says that Moses saw in the burning bush a certain very beautiful form, morphe, which one might have surmised to be an image of the being, in other words, of God. One might have surmised that. But surmised, I mean, we won't look at the word, in Philo implies a mistaken perception. And he reasons that this form must be identified as an angel, an angelos, because in effect it announced things, diangele, angels are messengers, they announce things which were about to happen. So what he's saying is you might draw the conclusion that this was the form of God, but no, it must be an angel. The next slide, Josephus says of God that he is clearly revealed in his works and in the benefits he conveys, but form, morphe, and magnitude are for us not talked about. They are aphatos, they are unspoken. This has been taken to mean that God really has form and magnitude, but that such attributes of divinity are inaccessible to humans. So God has a form, he has magnitude, at least in a certain sort of Jewish tradition, but we don't know what they are. But Josephus means to contrast the essential invisibility of God, who made all things without physical labor, with physical manufactured idols. That's the context here. So Jews differ from idolaters in that they have no reason, no cause to speak about the form and magnitude of the object of their worship, because God doesn't operate physically in the way that the manufacturer of an idol does. Beyond that, we cannot here begin to summarize, let alone evaluate, the full range of exegetical maneuvers by which scholars have sought to justify the traditional form of God interpretation, that morphe means essence or substance or nature or glory or image, and certain more exotic proposals along the lines that God was thought to have a gargantuan human-like or angelic body. In any case, Josephus has shown us the only plausible sense that can be given to the phrase morphe theou in the context of Hellenistic Jewish usage. Jews were fastidious about not attributing a morphe to the God of Israel for theological reasons, and because the word was so deeply associated with the pagan imagination and the practice of idol worship. The resistance of devout Jews to any notion of divine morphe, though, was more than matched by the fascination of Greeks and Romans, devout or otherwise, with the forms of the gods and their statues, the forms that were given to them in the statuary. Let me share a few examples. The fascination, slide 13, is nicely illustrated in a debate about how the gods make themselves known to people in which Socrates says to Euthydemus, "You will know that I speak the truth if you do not wait until you see the forms of the gods." Don't sit around waiting for a god to reveal himself so you can see what form he or she has. But satisfy yourself with seeing their works and honoring the gods. Side 14, Diodorus Siculus suggests that the first Egyptians to use speech took the natural elements, fire, earth, water, and air, to be gods and gave them names. And these elemental gods, in the company of Zeus, the father of all life, travel all the inhabited world, appearing to people in the forms, Morphes, of sacred animals, and at times turning into the shapes of people or of other things. And there's no slide for this, but in a lengthy polemic against idolatry, an argument, a piece against idolatry, Josephus says that some people have molded terror, anger, and deception and other base passions, human emotions, into the nature and form of a god, theomorphe. The gods who appear in the myths and whose statues are everywhere constitute an imaginative figuration of human fears and desires. The abstract quality, the emotion, human emotions, the abstract quality is given a distinctive outward appearance. This is what it looks like, and rendered perceptible to the mind's eye. Form of a god must have something to do with the outward appearance of a person, if you say this about someone. One other example from Philo, he complains about Caligula's habit of impersonating the gods. Like a mummer transforming himself on the stage, putting on all sorts of masks one after the other. Caligula dressed up as Apollo or Ares or whoever it was. Let him cease, this falsely named Apollo, imitating the true Apollo. I mean, this is interesting, coming from Philo, a devout Jew, in his odd way, allowing that there was this sort of real Apollo, at least sort of act like the real Apollo if you're going to pretend to be him, and not as the counterfeited coin is the form of a god. So you see what I'm getting at there? There's a question about how a god should appear to the world. That's the form of a god. It's the outward appearance. Caligula's disgraceful outward behavior was a gross misrepresentation of the form of Apollo, who healed social division. This is Philo's argument. Or of Ares, that's Mars, the god of war, who brought wars to an end. Caligula does quite the opposite. These examples merely scratch the surface, but the pattern of usage seems to me indisputable. There is no ground or precedent within the Jewish tradition for speaking of the Morphe of the one God. Indeed, there is opposition to the usage. There is abundant evidence, however, both in Jewish and Greek writings, for the use of the term with reference to the outward appearance or behavior of the gods. There is good reason to think, therefore, that a Greek audience in Philippi would have heard Paul saying that Jesus was in the form of a god, encountered either as a god in human form or as a divine man after the manner of Heracles or Pythagoras or Apollonius. The question then, of course, is whether good sense can be made of such an unorthodox thought in the context of the encomium. Paul may have been heard to say that, but is it what he meant? So, we get on to the second problem, the Harpagmos clause. Did not regard as something to be grasped. An interpretation of this expression has been widely appropriated in recent decades by scholars in the early higher Christology stream in support of the view that the pre-existent Jesus had equality with God in his possession in eternity, but chose not to exploit it for personal gain. I think that actually the basic interpretation of the idiom is correct, but it's been misapplied here, even by its originator. Next slide. Now, the argument goes back, you can do the track with me, it's a little technical here. The argument goes back to a 1971 essay by Roy Hoover, who proposed that what we have here is an idiomatic expression consisting of a verb meaning to consider or reckon, with harpagmon as a predicate object. So you consider something to be harpagmon. The harpazo, harpagmon, harpagmos, word group has the basic meaning of seizing. Harpazo means to seize something. And the verbal noun in this case is assumed to say something about the object, the thing, It is a thing to be seized or to be seized. The idiom has the sense of thinking that something is to be exploited, taken advantage of, used for benefit. However, when we examine the relatively small and late, it must be admitted, set of instances of this idiomatic expression, it is clear, even from Hoover's own study, that what is to be exploited for benefit or taken advantage of is always an opportunity. This emphasis disappears when we get to his interpretation of Philippians 2:6. When Hoover says, it puts it in these terms, it should be observed that this understanding of the Harpagmos statement carries with it the assumption that to ene isa theoi, that's the being equal to God thing, represents a status which belonged to the pre-existent Christ. It was a possession that he had. And this is in line, the line that many scholars in the last sort of 30, 40 years plus have taken. So, for example, Mark Keown's recent commentary on Philippians, he says that Harpagmos here likely speaks of something Jesus had to begin with and refused to exploit or use, not something he did not have or sought to gain. And I would have quoted Tom Wright on this, but his definition was so long-winded. We would have been here after the evening reading it out. In none of the passages considered, the example where the idiomatic expression is instanced, in none of these passages is the object of the seizing a thing that has been in the possession of the person for any length of time. It is always an opportunity presented more or less fortuitously, which may either be spurned or exploited to advantage. To give a simple example, I considered being invited to speak at this conference by you guys, Harpagmos, something to take advantage of, an opportunity to exploit for benefit. That would fit the paradigm exactly. So this would suggest that the being equal to God or a God should be regarded not as a prior possession, but as an opportunity, which Jesus at that moment decides not to seize. We will look at some examples later when we consider the sort of story that is being told. The third problem is this expression isa theoi, the equally to God or God equal to God part of this. What the object, he considered the equality to God, Harpagmos, a thing to be grasped or in some sense. It qualifies an action, it's adverbial, it qualifies a verb. It qualifies an action or a mode of being, in this case the verb to be. The distinction is difficult to capture in translation, but this and similar adverbial expressions seem to signify not direct identification, not ontology, not that this is the same person or thing, but being treated or regarded on equal terms with God or a God. So the emphasis shifts from the nature or identity of the object to the action or perception of the subject. Typically, a person is honored on a level equal with the gods. It's something like that. That's the sort of typical phrase that would use this adverbial isa theoi idea, language. So, let me give you a few examples. Slide 22. Diodorus Siculus observes that heroes, demigods, and many good men have been honored with sacrifices, in some cases like those offered to the gods, isotheos, in others as befitting heroes. Pythagoras was honored, next slide, among the Crotonians equally to the gods. He's a man, but he's honored. He's treated as though he is a god. Paul has being equal to a god or a god to God or a god rather than being honored. But as we explore the narrative contexts further, we will see how this may be understood to encapsulate the attainment of a position or status equal to that of the gods. We'll get on to that. Now, there's an obvious incident in the New Testament that illustrates how a Jewish wonder worker might have been perceived by pagan onlookers who then offer divine honors. Paul and Barnabas encounter a disabled man at Lystra. The man is healed, and the amazed crowds shout loudly in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of humans." Perhaps public misunderstandings like this really happened in the ancient world, but it was certainly familiar enough as a literary trope. when, this is from Homer's Odyssey, when Antinous, one of the suitors of Penelope, assaults the disguised Odysseus, he is warned that his victim may have been a god from heaven, for the gods do, in the guise of strangers from afar, put on all manner of shapes and visit the cities, beholding the violence and the righteousness of men. The next slide, the story of Baucis and Philemon, who offered humble hospitality to Jupiter and Mercury when they came in mortal guise, was popular in antiquity. It was well known that the gods would pop up on odd occasions looking like human people. So the priest of Zeus at Lystra hurriedly, this is the priest of Zeus outside the city, I presume he has to go back to his temple, comes in with oxen and garlands to make sacrifice to the apostles, to honor them as gods, as though they are equal to the gods. He's not claiming that they are gods necessarily, but at least because of what they've done, they deserve godlike honors. Diodorus again tells us that at Agirium, Heracles was honored on equal terms with the Olympian gods by festivals and splendid sacrifices. Although previously Heracles had not accepted such sacrifices, this time he gave his consent. So yes, okay, I will have sacrifices offered to me because the god, Zeus, I think, had been letting him know that he was going to achieve immortality. So he knows he's moving in a God direction, therefore it's okay to receive sacrifices. Paul, of course, does not give his consent to the offering of sacrifices, but takes the opportunity to run through his very Jewish and not very Christian, really, critique of Greek religious practice and to call the crowds to forsake their worthless objects of devotion and worship the living God. So Acts 17. Compare Acts 17. This is all Acts 14. So it is ironic then, having sort of given them this Jewish critique of paganism, Jews arrived from Iconium and turned the Greeks against Paul. He's stoned, dragged outside the city, and left for dead. And the incident, I think, mirrors rather closely our compressed story about Jesus. Paul, it's as though he's in the form of a god. You might have said that about him if you'd been there, in the eyes of pagan observers, because he has performed a marvelous deed. But he does not consider the offer of divine honors an opportunity to be seized. Then, thanks to misdirected Jewish hostility, he is found in appearance as merely mortal and painfully human. The aura of godlike immortality that Heracles would soon achieve has been violently dispelled. That's exactly the story that I think is told about Jesus in Philippians 2, 6 to 8. So, in some conclusions so far, these corrections to the traditional or mainstream view have left us with a compact outline of a critical moment in the career of Jesus from Nazareth. Number one, if Greeks from, say, Lystra or Philippi or Thessalonica had been present among the crowds who listened to his teaching and saw his miraculous acts, they may well have declared that he was either literally or figuratively in their minds in the form of a god. This remarkable person, secondly, did not consider a certain opportunity presented to him as something to be grasped at for benefit or advantage. And then thirdly, the opportunity consisted in attaining a status of equality with God or a god, of being honored as a god. What I propose next is to add some depth and color to these bare narrative bones, some flesh, to fill out the intervening spaces, to provide some context. On the understanding that the encomium, it compresses a more expansive way of speaking about the bodily pre-existence of the exalted heavenly Lord from the perspective of someone immersed in the religious culture of the pagan world, and I will name names later. One of the sources for Hoover's interpretation of the Harpagmos clause in Philippians 2:6 is the Ethiopica of Heliodorus of Emesa, one of a number of Greek romantic, that's where romantic came in, romantic novels to have survived from the 1st to 4th century. I mean, it genuinely is a romantic novel. There were five of these novels from about the 1st century through to the 4th century have survived. It's worth taking note of the genre because it may indicate that the idiom naturally belongs to popular stories of heroism, intrigue, and virtue tested. Now, the Ethiopica is the story of two lovers, Chariclea and Theagenes, who are on the run, who face many perils, and who eventually marry, needless to say. Chariclea is an Ethiopian princess. Theagenes is a Thessalian, a Greek nobleman. The idiom with Harpagma, in this case, occurs 3 times in connection with events that take place in Memphis in Egypt. Now, you've got to picture what's going on here. I'll sort of fill in the background a little bit. Theagenes, the young man, is here being pursued by the lovesick Arsas, who is the daughter of the satrap Orondates, an Egyptian official, and she has help from her scheming handmaid, Cybele. So you've got Chariclea and Theagenes are the lovers, but Arsas over here with her handmaid, Cybele, are trying to sort of get him away from her because Arsas has fallen in love with him. On one occasion, Cybele happens to learn that the couple are looking for accommodation and regards this happy circumstance as Harpagma, as the beginning of a way of ensnaring them by inviting them to stay at the palace. An opportunity has presented itself to her. She sees this as Harpagma. It's an opportunity to seize in order to fulfill her objectives. Then she reproaches Theagenes to his face. A young man so handsome and in his prime thrusts away a young woman of similar qualities who yearns for him and who does not regard the matter as Harpagma, nor even as a piece of good luck. So this woman is throwing herself at you. She says, why do you not seize the opportunity? And then the third instance, finally, Cybele resorts to the desperate suggestion that they have Chariclea killed in the hope that Theagenes will change his mind, forget about her, and fall in love with Arsas, or at least go off with Arsas. And Arsas this time considers this proposition Harpagma. She snatches at the schemer's words. The schemer has presented an opportunity to her and she snatches at it. Now these incidents give us a good sense of how this Harpagma or Harpagmos idiom was used. An opportunistic schemer either seizes or sort of typically presents a course of action for personal advantage. So to illustrate, a schemer, that's Josh or Daisy, invites me to speak at this conference, and I consider the being invited Harpagmon something to be grasped at. So we're all in error there. But the incidents also exemplify, I think, the sort of literary or narrative context in which the idiom was at home. This is not the elevated language of a hymn or of theological, profound theological reflection. And the German scholar Samuel Vollenweider worries about the vulgar connotations. He talks about the opportunities to be seized for sex and crime. Well, I think that's exactly right. But the suggestion here is precisely that it sort of opens up a crack, a window in Paul's properly Jewish comprehension of Jesus, allowing us to glimpse an alternative popular or folk depiction of him as a religious anti-hero caught up in a plot to ensnare him. Now, look, I may be overreading this, but I think that's worth asking, worth pursuing. We have another story about a handsome and virtuous young man pursued by the relative of an Egyptian court official, coincidentally, in Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews. And I was about to ask, does anyone know who that is? And of course, it's Joseph and Potiphar, the wife of Potiphar. The young man is Joseph. The besotted woman is the wife of Potiphar, who's fallen in love with him. And this is how Josephus puts it: on account of his beautiful form and his skillful management of affairs. That's household or business affairs, of course, not the other sort. Next slide. She thinks that if she entreats him to lie with her, he is bound to consider it a piece of good fortune, given the outward appearance of his current slavery. He's a slave, in effect. Surely a woman of her stature comes along and offers herself, he's going to see that as snatch it as a piece of good fortune. She does not take account of his upright manner of life, which persisted even with the change in circumstances. And of course, Joseph rebuffs her. Now, the word translated beauty of body is eumorphian, literally beautiful form. Morphe. Jesus was in the form of a god, and we may think was seen first to manage his affairs with great skill, healing the sick, casting out demons, speaking with wisdom and authority. Joseph has just recently had to exchange his freedom as a well-formed, beautifully formed son for the schema, the outward appearance of slavery. Jesus, the son sent to the mismanaged vineyard of Israel, took the form of a slave and was found in schemati as a human person. The language sort of is echoed here, and I think this part of what I'm trying to get at is that there are types of story that I think inform Paul's language, or whoever wrote this. The temptress expects Joseph to look upon her offer of great favor, a promotion in effect, as a piece of good fortune, something to be grasped at. Jesus does not look upon, same word, the opportunity to be promoted to a God-equal status as something to be seized. So there's sort of, Josephus and Paul are basically telling the same story, or at least the same type of story. A schemer makes an offer to an upright person in good form who does not regard it as something to be grasped at, even at great cost to himself. Another story from Josephus. Nimrod. You know who Nimrod was? You heard of Nimrod? Yep, the aircraft. He says, Josephus says that that it was a tyrant, Nimrod, who persuaded people to defy God after the flood, and who conceived the plan of building the Tower of Babel, which is now called Babylon. In this way, Nimrod sought to avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. The multitude willingly support the project, considering it slavery to submit to God. Now, that's the phrase. This is a little, we probably got to skip this, but we haven't. Considering it slavery to submit to God. Now, that is the same, so it's a double accusative construction, just like the Harpagmos one, with hegeomai. And a verbal object very similar to Paul's, he did not consider himself being on equal terms with God, an opportunity to perceive that. Take my word for it. But also, although the point is made positively rather than negatively, there is a thematic parallel here, which I think is important. The people seize the opportunity presented to them by the scheming demagogue Nimrod not to be subordinated to God. In other words, to have equality with God. Jesus, on the other hand, does not consider the achievement of a God-equal status something to be seized for advantage, but takes the form of a slave. They are going one way, he's going the other way. But the language and the narrative sort of style, the idioms involved, seem very similar. So, conclusion at this stage, what has emerged from these passages from Heliodorus and Josephus, I suggest, is a type of Hellenistic story which has at its heart a grammatical construction somewhat like Paul's Harpagmos clause, which in effect constitutes a narrative grammar, encapsulating a moral dilemma. A woman considers an opportunity to ensnare a young man something to be grasped at. A young man does not consider a woman's romantic advances something to be grasped at. Joseph is expected to consider his mistress's invitation a piece of good fortune, something to be grasped at. The Babel generation considers it slavery to submit to God, and implicitly, freedom, something to be grasped at. It's the same type of story being told. The person presented with the opportunity may be handsome or in beautiful form. The object of the temptation may consist in the acquisition of God-equal status and power. And of course, there is a schemer or seducer or tempter at the center of the action, Cybele, the wife of Potiphar, Nimrod. So here's what I'm saying. The opening lines of the Jesus encomium tell just this sort of story. In appearance and behavior, he is in the form of a god. He turns his back on an opportunity to attain God-equal status, prestige, power, honors. He empties himself. Instead, he takes the form of a slave and is found indeed to be merely human or mortal. All we need now is a schemer, and it shouldn't be too difficult to find one. There is one standout occasion in the Synoptic Gospels when Jesus is presented with the opportunity to become equal to God or to a god. The relevance of the story of the testing in the wilderness for understanding Philippians 2:6 was noted by Colin Brown. It said basically the form of God is roughly the image of God in which humanity was created. Therefore, being like God is Adam's original dominion over creation in return for obeisance to Satan. There is, however, no equivalence in the Septuagint between Morphe and icon, between form and image, and what is offered to Jesus by Satan is not dominion over living creatures. It is rule over the kingdoms in Luke of the oikumene, effectively of the empire, certainly of this world that is surveyed within the scope of Paul's mission. This is playing out in the political sphere, not in creation as a whole. Satan's proposition is not presented in the Gospels explicitly in terms of a divine ruler cult, but both in Jewish and in Hellenistic Roman traditions, such an interpretation was in easy reach. The type of the pagan king who arrogates for himself a God-equal status is denounced in the Old Testament and other Jewish writings. The king of Babylon was brought down to earth because he aimed to set his throne in heaven above the stars of God, boasting that he would make himself like the Most High. The prince of Tyre in Ezekiel 8 starts out as an Adam-like figure, but he becomes proud, declaring himself to be a god, one who sits in the seat of the gods, who has the mind of a god. So Yahweh will bring nations against him, and his mortality will be obvious to all. You shall die the death of the uncircumcised by the hand of foreigners. Antiochus IV Epiphanes shall consider himself greater than any god and shall speak horrendous things against the God of gods in Daniel 11. According to the account of his grotesque death in 2 Maccabees, the tyrant finally admits that it is right to be subject to God and for one who is mortal not to think God-equal thoughts that are equal to a god. Herod Agrippa pays a similar price for not repudiating the public acclamation, the voice of a god and not of a mortal. The man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians encapsulates many of these impious traits. One, opposing and exalting himself against every being called God or object of worship, with the result that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming that he himself is a god. That is how I translate it. Christian apocalyptic tradition, moreover, conceived of an unholy alliance, and I realize that if this treads on your toes, I'm sorry. Conceived of an unholy alliance between Satan and Roman imperial power. The dragon, who is called the devil and Satan, stands on the shore and gives his power and his throne and great authority to the beast, which emerges from the sea, which is an authority over every tribe and people and language and nation. Now, I think that's Rome. You may have other views on the matter. This is now the supreme instance of blasphemous pagan kingship. And it seems reasonable to suppose that the tradition has some overlap with the story of the temptation in the wilderness. When Satan offers Jesus the kingdoms of the world or of the empire and their glory, the implication is that he will take that authority away from Caesar and give it to Jesus. In other words, Satan proposes to do exactly what the Ancient of Days does in Daniel 7. He will give the kingship and dominion and the greatness and of the kingdoms under the whole heaven, which have been taken from the beast, fourth beast, which is destroyed, and given to the one like a son of man. Such diabolical kingship certainly comes with divine status. So Jesus, if he'd accepted this offer, would declare himself to be a god. He would make himself equal to a god. He would think God-equal thoughts. He would take his seat among the gods. He would receive divine honors. But it is conditional upon him worshipping Satan and not the Ancient of Days, and he will have none of it. Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him. He does not consider the offer of divine kingship presented to him by the schemer Satan an opportunity to be seized at. Instead, he emptied himself. And there is another story to be told here, and then we're done. In a treatise on the Ten Commandments, in which he intends not to omit any allegorical meaning, which may perchance be concealed beneath the plain language, Philo addresses the question of why God gave laws to his people, not in cities, but in the deep desert. So why did Moses lead the people out into the wilderness for them to receive the law? The reason is that cities are typically full of unspeakable evils, especially pride, which Philo regards as the cause of dissension, conflict, and all the impieties, absurdities, and depravities of pagan religion. People have given form to an infinite variety of images. Now, you've got the word morpho there again. An infinite variety of images and statues, and have shown them honors equal to the Olympians and equal to the gods. Therefore, it was from having a regard to these facts in the first place that Moses decided on giving his laws outside of the city. But it is one thing to get the people out of the corrupt city. It is another to get the corruptions of the city out of the people. Philo speaks of Moses leading them away from the harmful customs of the cities into the wilderness, that he might empty, kenose, their souls of unrighteous deeds. Moses empties the people, or leads them out for them to be emptied. From a certain point of view, the miracle-working Jesus had been in the form of a God, powerful, charismatic, captivating, virtuous, and wise beyond the capacities of ordinary humans. To the pagan mind, it was an easy classification to make, certainly rhetorically, perhaps literally. This was no shabby counterfeit after the manner of the vainglorious Caligula. Nevertheless, when the opportunity was presented to him to attain divine offers, a position equal to that of a god or of God, he saw through the ploy. He refused to grasp at it. He did not yield to the seduction. And instead, in the wilderness, he emptied himself. And I don't know if I can say this. He emptied himself of the passions and ambitions that made the seduction so dangerous, so devilish. And significantly, having emptied the souls of the people of corrupting passions, what does Moses do? He feeds them with the words of the law. He feeds them with the words of the law, Philo says. In the same way, well, what does Jesus do? He expresses his loyalty to Yahweh by quoting from Deuteronomy, explicitly stating that one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. So do we have some sort of Hellenistic Jewish religious trope here? Souls emptied of ambition in the wilderness, filled instead with the word of God? I think that the passage provides a sort of ideological matrix for the development of thought in this part of the encomium. On the one hand, you've got a critique of idolatry, which provides a frame for a self-emptying that consists in the rejection of divine honors. On the other, and this is important, if you're still awake, if you're still with me, the need for the community of God's people to empty themselves of the corrupting pressures of city life helps to explain the practical application of the encomium in context. Do nothing from selfish ambition or empty conceit. Exactly the forms of moral weakness that might have caused Jesus to stumble, but he was obedient. We do not need to suppose direct dependence here, only that such stories, such motifs, such typologies were readily available in the cultural religious repertoires of diaspora Judaism. So, in conclusion, behind Philippians 2:6 is a type of popular Hellenistic, even Hellenistic Jewish story in which a protagonist is presented with an opportunity which may be seized for personal advantage. There is likely to be a moralistic aspect of the story. The opportunity may be presented by a schemer or seducer or seductress. The opportunity presented may be unethical or impious. The excellence and virtue of the protagonist may be emphasized, and seizing the opportunity may be regarded as a fall or a failure. The opening lines of the encomium tell such a story about Jesus in a very condensed fashion from a Hellenistic perspective at a popular level. Jesus would have appeared to the Greek onlooker as a person in the form of a god of excellent character, prowess, and power. When offered by the schemer Satan his own ruler cult, with all the attendant divine honors, he did not consider the opportunity something to be grasped at. Instead, through the wilderness experience, Jesus emptied himself of selfish ambition and vainglory, vain conceit that would fuel such a political program. Like Caligula, perfect example. The outcome was that he was left outside the city for dead, like Paul at Lystra, plainly not in the form of a god, but in the form of a slave, exposed as being only too human. The encomium presents and explains the baffling career of the future ruler of the nations to the pagan or post-pagan mind. The second part of the encomium asserts a further reversal in reputation. It is now a remarkable fact that the name of the invisible heavenly Kurios, the Lord Jesus Christ, is held in high esteem by a growing number of Greeks, and the author of the encomium is confident that sooner or later across the Greek-Roman world, every tongue would confess that he is Lord to the glory of the God of Israel. Paul comes back to Lystra a short time afterwards. He's joined by a young, gifted disciple called Timothy, whose father was a Greek and mother a Jewish believer in Jesus. Timothy must have seen the world in part through pagan eyes. It's likely he had witnessed or heard about the previous incident. He is a co-sender of the letter to the Philippians. If we want to put a name to the person who wrote or inspired our encomium, or the longer story that it encapsulates, do we need to look any further? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Sorry? Oh, yes, questions, yeah.
I thought I'd gone on long enough.
No, go ahead.
Back to the mic.
I just wanted to say just one thing. And we've got some copies of Andrew's book. And so this is your unique UK Rio to get a signed copy, maybe?
A copy, yes.
Yes,
signed.
will you sign it?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah, great.
And cheap.
Oh, yes. So, yeah.
If you want to buy it.
Brilliant. So it's a Unitarian-friendly book, signed by a Trinitarian professor. It's a unique opportunity to be grasped at. Thank you.
Have you been sitting there all this time trying to work that one out? That's brilliant. Well done.
Thank you for your presentation. I don't remember, because I read the book like the first week it came out, but I don't remember if you had discussed a little bit of Philippians chapter 3, where Paul seems to set himself up as an example of someone who has a lot of Jewish privileges, but he empties himself of them. He calls them skibala in hopes that he would attain for the resurrection of the dead. And several scholars have suggested there's a connection there. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I mean, I can. It would have been in the paper. I had it there, and they took it out because it was too much. I think the Acts passage is far more relevant. Because there's. I mean, yes, you can see it. I think Paul would have taken that, would have agreed with you up to a point, because clearly he sees himself living through Christ's experiences, and this is his imitation of Christ. So yes, in principle, in practice, you don't have the whole sort of pagan part to this that I think is important. You don't have the being in the form of a God part. You don't have this ambition to be equal to a God. So there are important elements missing from that passage. So yes, in as much as Paul quite consciously, I think, quite intentionally sought to follow Christ in his suffering, in his death, and if possible, in his resurrection from the dead, I don't think it can be pressed quite as far as the example from a pagan, putting it in a very pagan context, so that experience of the clash with paganism.
Yeah. But Paul is certainly not emptying himself of pre-incarnate, co-equality with God in his example. It's an example that potentially could clarify what is in Philippians 2.
So Paul's temptation, yes, you'd have to sort of work that through, because what Paul was tested with, what he was tempted with, and what he was doing was a very different thing. So that was in fulfillment of the law, and so he could claim a righteousness on that basis, which doesn't work in this context, certainly the way I've presented it. But yeah, I mean, the general point is perfectly valid. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Perriman. That was fascinating, and I'm very sympathetic to this interpretation. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about Philippians 2:7. So many readers look at this portion of it and think it sounds like Jesus is becoming human, that he wasn't human before.
Yeah. So that's
where it
the
says assuming human likeness and
yeah.
being found in appearance as a human. In this translation, it says that.
Having sort of spent 4 or 5 chapters on verse 6, in the book, I sort of run out of patience. I treat that a little generally and rather loosely, so I'm not going to try and give a very precise answer to it. There's an argument about the what's the participle from sorry? Yeah. As whether that in itself entails a sort of change of status or change of an ontology. And I know Matthew Bates makes a huge argument out of this, and he's not alone. The participle appears all over the place in the Septuagint simply as a way of making a note that saying that people existed at a certain point, often in the context of genealogies. So it's a way of speaking of, I think, of just a past existence from the perspective of Paul looking back on the life of Jesus. I think it works well enough if we say that this is all about public perception, how he was perceived, and there's a transition from being perceived as a godlike person in the form of a god to being acknowledged to be. What does that found to be? In likeness of a human, isn't it? In the form of a slave. I think there's a little bit too much in there for me to try and unpack at the moment. The way I told the story here, I put the emphasis on how people would have seen that this is not one of the immortals. This is a very mortal person, and actually has sort of fallen from that former status that he had. Off the top of my head, I don't think I have much to add to that. I go away and think about it on the train home and come back tomorrow and I'll think of something better to say.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Andrew. Thank you for your talk. Some of it went a bit over my head, so if I'm asking something that you've already covered, then sorry, but...
No, I'll pretend I haven't.
Okay. I did write down 2 questions, if you wouldn't mind. So the first one is, I had conversations with people regarding this verse, and one of them brought up this verse as proof of Jesus being the literal physical image of God. And I pointed out that the form of God, as used in this verse here, is contrasted with the form of a slave. Yeah. And so I proposed that, therefore, form, in this sense, is referring to status rather than appearance. Yeah. And so my question was, what do you think of Morphe not being related to physical appearance due to it being contested with the form of a slave, that is, a low status instead of an exalted one, and not related to appearance? Would you say that it would be sensible to conclude that we can rule out a passage describing Jesus as being God, taking on a literal appearance of a human, but rather that it's describing Jesus' highly exalted status? Does that make sense?
I didn't. To be honest, I didn't follow all of that. So I will.
If I can put it very briefly, would you say we can rule out Morphe being related to physical appearance, but rather to only...
You said status? No, yes. I say quite not exactly the opposite to that. I think the physical appearance, now it's not necessarily saying that Jesus physically looked like a god. It may have that connotation, and you can't sort of press it too far. This is a very succinct little statement, and I'm inclined to think that it sort of encapsulates a much bigger way of talking about Jesus. But as far as I can tell, and I think there's plenty, the evidence is clear, and I'm not alone in saying this, that if you're going to talk about the Morphe of anything, you're talking about what you can see. It's the physical, the outward appearance. Now, that could extend to behavior, and all, you can work outwards from there. You can't work inwards from there. So that actually, which has been the traditional argument, that somehow that refers to something that's internal to God, his nature, his character, his glory. Well, glory is perhaps an external thing. That's a slightly different issue. So the form of a slave is exactly the same thing. It's not saying that Jesus was dressed like a slave, or that he was in shackles, or he had long hair like a slave, or however you recognize a slave at the time. But it's in outward appearance. You look at him, people look at him, especially someone who's executed and dies on a cross. Well, that's degrading to the point of being a slave. So it's that perception, the outward judgment of who this person is. He was originally judged, say, this hypothetical Greek, or maybe actual Greeks, watching what was going on in Israel at the time, might have said, a little bit like the centurion, truly this man was a son of God, or the Son of God. That's a sort of a Jewish expression. Others might have put it in other terms, or seen him earlier and said, this is Heracles. This is, they were reminded of stories of Heracles. I think that's the outward appearance is exactly the point, which is why morph is important. Morphe, it's what you look like, how people perceive you.
But still, it being degrading is to do with status, right?
Yes, no, clearly status goes along with it. But if you're going to use the word morphe doesn't mean status. So it's a status that is attached to someone who appears like this. I'm not excluding status. And I mean, yes, we could put this in terms of standing or status in people's eyes. That wouldn't be wrong. But in terms of dealing with the theological argument, first we need to establish, I think, the very simple point that this is not a word that can be used of the one true living God who made the heavens and the earth.
Okay, thanks. Again, one more question.
We got too many people.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right.
Go to the back of the queue.
Yeah, you can go back and line.
I didn't know there were so many people.
Thanks for that talk, Andrew. Regarding the double accusative construct that Hoover's whole article deals with, what do you make of the articular infinitive there, and do you see it functioning anaphorically at all? Like reaching back?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I deal with that in the book. And it's there's a number, because you've got it in that Nimrod passage. There's an there's an infinitive with the verb. The submission, the submitting to God, or whatever it is. Well, I forget the word, Ikain. It's there. Within a narrative framework, possibly, yes. I don't think it depends on that. I mean, there's Wallace's argument about this being there because of this. It's to differentiate, I think, between the two accusatives. I forget exactly how he does it. I don't think the conclusion I came to was that's not significant. It may have an anaphoric function if we want to bring more of the story into focus. So, perhaps it's it's there because it's pointing back to a known story, in some way, of Jesus in the wilderness turning down the offer of rule over the kingdoms of the earth or the world.
Yeah, but not, and morphe theou, though, right?
No, I don't. No, definitely not.
Good, I think we're in agreement on that.
I mean, I'm not sure I can give you a reason exactly for that. No, I was very clear in the book. It does not refer back to form of God as being somehow equivalent to, or being in the equality with God as being equivalent to form of God. No, I don't think they are equivalent.
Thanks. And this, your book and everything is very dear to my heart as it touches on a lot of my dissertation research as I'm focusing on verses 7 and 8, actually. So I'm going to try to expand upon some of the work you've done. A more practical question to follow up. With the encomium, what would you see to be the application in the ecclesial context, not political? Because you mentioned a lot about the political context of the folklore myth. And what would you see the ecclesial context would be for that? Like, how would it be worked out in a church? Like,
I wouldn't, I would try and work it out in the same way that Paul works it out, which is via the political context. And this is why I think, actually, if it points us to thinking eschatologically, now, I mean, when I say eschatologically, I mean, I'm thinking about how Paul engaged with his future, what he expected to happen. And I think his future was much more sharply focused than our futures are, the way we think about the future. I think if we could focus on where is God in the future, and does it work? Because, I mean, in a sense, what Paul's doing here is this is a story that was told back then, and we're not repeating the story that Paul is telling. So maybe we simply have to remember the significance of that from Paul. But I think it does point us towards part of our liturgy. Our liturgy ought to bring the God of history into our communities, whereas so much of it is okay. We draw on the Psalms, or wherever. We're always going back. We're going back 2,000 years, 2,500 years, or whatever it is. One of the things we might learn from this is that we engage with the God, with our situation. God, how does God engage with us now? What is He doing at this moment in this, in our context? How do we pray? See, then you can't praise Jesus for it because He's not involved in quite the same way. You've made this. The point has been made this today. We honour Him as Lord, as King. He became king on the basis of what I've just described here, this whole story. That's not being acted out amongst us now. It wasn't acted out 30, 40 years ago. It was acted out 2,000 years ago. So that's a very muddled answer to your question. The basic point I would suggest then, is that what I just said, that can we bring the God of history into our liturgy? So that we reflect in our worship, or whatever it is that however we express things. It wouldn't be an encomium. In a hymn, for example, or some other storytelling exercise that we might go about. That it's about what we're experiencing now, or in recent experience, or in near future experience, that we bring into the liturgy. I think that might be one lesson we could draw from it in that respect.
So I've got about a bajillion questions, but I'm not going to ask all of them now because we'll be here for a while. So I'm just going to have one very simple question. How has this view been received in general, the scholarly community? Is it popular? Is it not? Is it...
The reason I brought books here, sorry, I mean, clap if you like. The reason I brought books with me is that I know that you might buy them. I'm not going to sell them anywhere else. I honestly don't know. I mean, I did a couple of interviews, one with David Capes and one with Mike Bird, who were editors of the book, and both of them sort of, I would put in the early... I mean, Mike Bird's interesting, actually, and in his thinking. But I'd probably put both of them in sort of an early high Christology category. I'm a sort of marginal... I'm not a sort of mainstream scholar, so I don't get a lot of feedback. They were intrigued by it. I mean, they certainly weren't going to commit themselves, but I do think they were intrigued by it. I hope there was enough I was pleased that they picked the book up as, to be part of the series. That was encouraging. But no, basically I'm dependent on you guys for selling copies. So if you could help me out at all, that would not by buying, but anyway, putting in a good word for me.
Yeah, hi Andrew, thank you very much. Is there any sort of a grammatical, literary justification for taking the view in the encomium? I learned a new word tonight. I mean, it ends with the high exaltation of Jesus. Is there any justification that the existing in the form of God, or as a present thing, standing currently in that form, i.e. launching out into the encomium with his immortal, resurrected state, and then maintaining the thrust of your presentation,
I see what you mean.
How he got there. So in other words, making the thing, this Jesus is in the form of God because he's resurrected, immortal, and when he was seen on earth, but obviously now kind of invisible in glory. And then saying how he got there as a didactic, for the Philippian elders, they should follow suit. So what I'm saying is, does it have to be a past tense? Certainly we don't agree in the pre-incarnate form of God, and not a historical earthly ministry form of God, but actually his current position at the point of speaking and Paul's declaration of him as Lord, and then explaining how he got to that position. I mean,
I've heard that. I have come across that argument before. You've still got to explain why. Then it would be in the form of God. That I still don't think that works. It'd have to have somehow. You'd have to sort of tip that round and be God in the form of Jesus, almost, because you still got the problem that God does not have form. And if it's a sort of post-resurrection, is that enough to justify God having a form? I'm not sure.
No,
I think the big
resurrected Messiah, Jesus, the one they're proclaiming, is by virtue of his exaltation and resurrection, immortality, is in the form of God, not God, but in the form of God.
Is now in the form of God.
But I haven't looked into it thoroughly. I have heard the argument, which I'm intrigued.
Yeah, no, I've heard the argument.
Is it a past existed in the form
it's
of
not
God?
a part. It's a present participle.
Exactly.
I think it'd be a very odd way to construct the line of thought there. I think almost certainly not. But I mean, I'm not to sort of give you a definitive no to that.
Okay.
Would be a little tricky.
I'm not looking for anything definitive.
I'll go away. I'm going to be kept awake all night.
Ruled out from the grammar and the tense.
Almost certainly can be ruled out simply because it's just too far away in the sort of the sentence structure from that. That would be a very surprising way of making that point. And I still think you've got problems of using the Morphe with God, the one true God, at that point. Okay. I'm going to have a sleepless night fretting about that.
Yeah, you have a good night's sleep.
Yeah, thank you.
So I know you did talk about it. So I just wondered if you just expand briefly on the kind of the Jewish thought and Jewish understanding of Morphe in relation to kind of the old times understanding and a more modern day understanding.
Sorry,
of it.
What was it? The old.
So kind of like the old understanding in like the, I guess like in terms of like the Old Testament and when they're translating the Septuagint. So like, for example, like there is a verse in Job where it says, a form stood before my eyes and I heard a hushed voice. So
I thought that said, yeah, I mean, that's, for some reason, I didn't take that. I'm not sure. I may have not taken that passage seriously in the book. I'm not sure that's the correct translation. What's the translation?
I don't know. I'm just reading it from.
I thought the point was that he sees no form. He hears a voice, or there's a breath of wind or something, and he hears no form.
A spirit glided past my face, and the hair on my body stood on end.
I mean, it's a little bit like that passage from Josephus where we don't talk about the form and magnitude of God. Does that mean that God has a form? We don't talk about it, or we don't talk about it because he doesn't have one. And that I read that as there wasn't a form. He didn't see anything. Something has made a sound, or something has made the air move, but he sees no physical object that would have done it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that God did that and God has a form, but he can't see it. Right. I think that was how I took that.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Hi. So I was also wondering about this, the form of God and how Jesus being in the form of God. It just came to my mind that it could be, but it may be not, a reference to the Transfiguration on the Mount of Olives, because there it says that Jesus's face was altered and the clothing that he had became dazzling white. So he was, changed before their eyes to a godly like appearance, because in Ezekiel 1:26 to 28 there is a description of what God, not what God looked like, because it's talking about the glory of God, and Ezekiel talks about this is what the glory of God looked like. And when you read the description, it's very clear that he's describing a being that has like a human appearance, but you can't see him because his glory is so brilliant and dazzling and actually white when you study it a bit more closely. So I just thought there seems to be a parallel there, but maybe it doesn't actually fit into the Philippians 2 chapter.
I mean, it's certainly a question worth asking. It's something to explore. The nature of the theophany in Ezekiel 2, do we see anything like that happening in the Gospels? Well, perhaps the Transfiguration. I mean, you might sort of go back to the baptism as a significant revelatory moment, which is very different to Ezekiel chapter 1. But sorry, take the Transfiguration thing. My reading of the Transfiguration I associate that with this, probably with the Son of Man vision, partly because it sort of follows on directly after the teaching about the Son of Man, taking up your cross and that whole thing, and the coming of the Son of Man and the vindication of those who've taken up their crosses to follow him. Am I right? Because it comes straight after that. And then also Peter, in one of Peter's letters, isn't he picks up on that idea. My view would be that if, yes, there's a sort of transformation there. Does it use the Morphe? I can't remember. I think it's metaschematizo. It's not the Morpho, no. And interestingly, the schema in schemati is a word that is used for clothing. So that works very well, which is why I think Perriman is wrong when he talks about that being a reference to the clothing of Jesus. Morphe is not the right word to use with reference to transfigured clothing. Schema is, I think. So it's worth thinking about. It's a possibility that has sort of fed into this. He was in the form of a God. It's one of the extraordinary things, except it was a private vision. So that worked from my point of view. No, that doesn't work, because I'm thinking of a casual Greek standing there watching what's going on. And the things you see are the crowds following, and you hear him teaching on a mountain, and you see him healing people. And there's a whole thing, there's a divine man argument about how Mark describes Jesus in places. And the argument there is that he has been influenced by, in the language that he uses, in the way he tells these stories, by certain Hellenistic divine man traditions, which I'm sort of in two minds about, but it would be that perspective. The casual Greek onlooker, how would he see him? What conclusions would he reach? And drawing on his cultural repertoire, he thinks this is a form of a God. This is a divine man. That's how I would make sense of him. And when Paul is trying to sort of get the Philippians to understand this backstory part and tells them stories of a wonder-working person, they're going to, that language and those terminology is going to naturally come to mind for them. So I would say the Transfiguration is not relevant, probably. And I don't think you've got the sort of theophany in the Synoptic Gospels that would suggest that that fits in. I mean, that would be an argument if you were talking about a pre-existent Christ, potentially. Though it's a form that God takes as he appears on earth. Whether that would apply to God in heaven beforehand, I'm not sure.